The sound of war drums rumbled intensely as if echoing from the depths of history. The faint haze of gunpowder smoke covered a battlefield, slowly emerging in the first light of dawn. In that atmosphere, one could see silhouettes standing on a small hill, hands gripping an old rifle tightly, their eyes unwavering even as death crept closer with every step. The strange thing is, they knew they might lose. They knew that in front of them stood the most elite and powerful army in the world at that time. But they still stood there, shoulder to shoulder, like warriors drawn to the battlefield not by orders, but by their belief in freedom and the future. That battle took place more than 2 centuries ago, but its echoes still shake the history of the United States. A defeat, but a defeat that made the whole world reconsider the strength of the human spirit. And right now, you are about to step into that story. Before we begin, leave a comment about what makes you admire the fighting spirit of the American people. And if you love history, subscribe to the U.S. History Channel to join us in exploring the moments that decided the fate of a nation. Boston, early 1775. The once bustling port city was now sinking into a suffocatingly heavy atmosphere. Not a single citizen walked through the streets without feeling the cold gaze of British guards following them. The flags of the British Empire fluttered atop buildings like a reminder that this place was no longer the land of freedom for the settlers. It resembled a giant prison, controlled by guns and orders from a distant government across the ocean. After the Boston Tea Party, when crates of tea were dumped into the sea as a symbol of resistance, the British Crown decided to respond by strangling the city. They brought many elite regiments to Boston, imposed new laws, dissolved the local council, and stripped the colonists of their right to self-govern. Places once filled with voices and hope now held only the steady footsteps of guards at night. Boston was no longer Boston. It was a powder keg, and no one knew when the spark would ignite. In that silence, the resistance movement began to spread. Ordinary people, farmers, merchants, fishermen, now became members of the militia. They formed secret training groups, shared news with one another, smuggled gunpowder and supplies. They knew they were weaker, poorly equipped, but they had something the British Army did not: an ideal. The ideal that their children must live in a free land, not controlled by decrees from a monarch an ocean away. On April 19, 1775, the first spark ignited. The gunshots at Lexington and Concord shook all of New England. That short but bloody battle made both sides understand one truth: the war for independence had officially begun. No more retreat, no more compromise, no more hope of reconciling with the Kingdom of Great Britain. From the towns surrounding Boston, the colonists gathered, carrying hunting rifles, axes, dry rations, and an uncommon determination. Thousands surrounded the city, isolating the British forces. However, surrounding alone was not enough. They needed a strategic position to control every movement of the British. Looking at the terrain map around Boston, they found 2 hills on the Charlestown Peninsula, just a short distance from the city. Bunker Hill and Breed Hill were the keys. Controlling these hills would allow the colonists to place cannons and attack any ship, while seeing clearly every movement of the British. In small wooden houses where candles flickered in the night, militia commanders sat around wooden tables planning the attack. They knew this was a risky move, but if they lost Boston, they would lose their ability to resist. The decision was made in silence, but everyone understood it would change everything. On June 16, 1775, as darkness covered the entire Charlestown Peninsula, the militiamen began to move. They would seize the hill before daylight. They would dig fortifications. They would prepare for a battle that could take their lives. But they still did it because they believed that the sacrifice today would trade for the future tomorrow. That was the moment when history quietly began to shift. And no one knew that just a few hours later, this place would become an immortal symbol of the American fighting spirit. On the night of June 16, 1775, darkness fell over the Charlestown Peninsula with a strange atmosphere. The sky was pitch black, and the wind blowing across the wooden rooftops seemed to whisper that something was about to happen. The colonists did not return home as they usually did, but quietly gathered at secret meeting points. No one talked much. No one showed fear. Everyone understood that tonight might be the last night they would see Boston from afar in peace. When the moon was covered by thick clouds, hundreds of silhouettes silently moved toward the hills overlooking the city. Each person carried a hoe, a shovel, or empty sacks to carry soil. Their footsteps blended together, forming a heavy yet determined rhythm like a colony of ants moving their nest. The militia commander stood in front, looking into the darkness covering Breed's Hill. They knew well that choosing this hill instead of Bunker Hill was not a perfect choice. But it was closer to Boston, had higher ground, and was the point the British artillery would be forced to retake at all costs. A young officer looked around and quietly said that when morning came, they would be attacked fiercely. No one answered. They simply kept walking, gripping the crude tools they would use to build the defensive line that their lives depended on. At exactly midnight, the first strikes of the hoes echoed. The soil was soft, damp, and heavy, but they dug without stopping. Every strike was a silent oath that no matter what happened the next morning, they would still stand on this ground. As the fortifications began to rise higher, the night grew darker, and the wind from the sea blew stronger, carrying a coldness that made their hands numb. But no one stopped. No complaints, no grumbling. Only the sound of shovels cutting into the earth and sacks being dragged through the darkness. An older man, his white hair fluttering in the wind, quietly looked toward the lights of Boston across the river and said he was thinking of his son, who had just been born a few months ago. Another soldier said he hoped that if he fell, the old man's son would live in a land where British soldiers no longer patrolled the streets. The two said nothing more, but the silence carried more weight than any oath. Near dawn, the earthen rampart had risen nearly 2 meters high and stretched along a strategic curve. When the first faint sunlight appeared, a young soldier lifted his head and immediately widened his eyes in horror. In the distance, inside the city of Boston, the British had discovered the change on the hill. War drums echoed, horns sounded the assembly call, and then the silhouettes of redcoats began forming ranks under the morning light. At that moment, the colonists understood that the decisive hour had come. They tightened their grip on their guns. Their weapons had little ammunition, and many did not even know if their guns would work properly. But they did not leave their positions. Not a single person retreated. On their faces appeared a strange calmness, as if they had accepted their fate, but were also ready to fight until their last breath. That night, an untrained army created a miracle. They turned darkness into a fortress and fear into courage. In just a few hours, Breed's Hill would become the place that witnessed one of the most tragic and heroic moments in American history. The Boston sea wind blew in icy gusts across the dirtbags, still bearing the handprints of the militia. The morning of June 17 opened not with the sound of birds, but with a tense silence so tight it felt suffocating. On Breed's Hill, thousands of men in simple clothing, brown and gray coats, sometimes just rough fabric, stood close together behind the earthworks. They looked down into the valley below, where the red of the British soldiers was moving like a stream of fire about to surge upward. From the top of the hill, they saw the smoke rising from the British camp. They saw the neatly aligned ranks marching step by step across the endless green fields around Charlestown. Every step taken by the Royal Army felt like it was pressing down on the chests of the militiamen who had never been in battle once. But no one ran, no one stepped back. At the foot of the hill, General Howe rode along the line of troops. He looked up at the dirt fortifications that had been built overnight, astonished by the endurance and boldness of the colonists. To him, this battle should have been simple.
A group of untrained rebels could not possibly stand long against a professional army of the Empire. But the sight of the tall, solid fortifications and thousands of gun barrels pointing down from above unsettled him. On the hill, Colonel Prescott stood silent, eyes fixed on every movement of the British. He understood that everything depended on this moment. His men had little ammunition. Each person had only a few rifle bullets. Some carried makeshift bayonets, others had almost nothing besides their willingness to die. He walked along the earthworks, seeing young faces filled with determination. Prescott stopped, and his voice rose above the wind. "They will come closer. Don't fire early. Don't waste the one bullet that could save the life of the man standing next to you." Those words later became legend. Amidst that tense silence, the sky suddenly trembled with the sound of British war drums. From afar, rows of British soldiers emerged from the gunpowder smoke, moving steadily like red walls. Behind them, cannons were dragged into favorable firing positions. The entire ground seemed to shake with each heavy step. And then, the moment everyone knew would come, arrived. The British lined up neatly, raised their guns, ready to advance up the hillside. On the ramparts, the militia held their breath. They felt their hands tremble slightly, but there was no fear in their eyes. Only determination, only the resolve to hold the land, hold freedom, hold Boston for the next generation. Every minute passed as long as an hour. Every British step hit like a heartbeat. Every American breath blended into the wind and the mud. And when the distance between the two sides narrowed to only a few dozen meters, the Bunker Hill battle line was ready to explode, just waiting for a command, just waiting for a glance, just waiting for the moment that would define the fighting spirit of an entire nation.
The morning on Breeze Hill seemed endlessly long. Thin mist covered the fortifications. The sunlight had just risen above the horizon, shining on the faces full of dirt, sweat, and determination of the militiamen who had stayed awake all night. At the foot of the hill, the British began to move. Their heavy footsteps made the ground tremble, as if the entire sky was also waiting for the fateful moment about to happen. The red-coated formation advanced with the familiar confidence of an army that had conquered half the world. And on the hill, the Colonial soldiers tightened their grip on their old rifles, with only a few bullets left in their packets, but with a will no one could ever count. Colonel Prescott walked along the battle line, his eyes slowly sweeping across each face. Some were only 20 years old, their hands still trembling slightly. Some were fathers of 3 children, but still chose to stay. Prescott stopped, and his voice came out like a blade carving into the air. "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." That sentence was not meant to scare. It was the truth of a desperate situation. Too little ammunition, too little chance of survival. And every bullet had to become a strike against the army advancing like a red flood. The closer the British came, the louder the shouting grew. The flags snapped in the Boston sea wind. On faces reddened by the sun, the royal officers believed this attack would be easy. They believed those rough farmers would panic and flee. They believed that just one charge would sweep away the colonial defenses. But that belief slowly cracked as they stepped into the sights of the men standing above. The distance was only a few dozen meters. No one on the hill fired. There was only the sound of heavy breathing, only the wind stretching the sandbags tight, only the pounding of hearts beating as if they would tear through chests. A British officer later said he did not understand why the militia had not fired. He only felt a strange silence, as if the hill itself was waiting for the right moment. And then that moment came.
Prescott raised his hand in signal. No shout, no scream, just a single decisive motion. In the next second, the entire hilltop erupted. Hundreds of guns fired at once. The blasts collided with each other, stretching out like thunder. Fire burst from the fortifications, and smoke rolled upward, covering a corner of the sky. The British formation wavered as if struck by a giant wave. The once orderly ranks coalesced instantly. Officers and soldiers fell at the same time, and those behind panicked, stepping on weapons, stepping on their comrades to find safety. The screams of the British blended with the cries of the militia on the hill. This was no longer an attack. This was the truth laid bare. Americans could fight. Americans could shoot. Americans were not afraid of an empire. In that moment, something changed. Both armies felt it. The British realized this war would not be short, and the Americans understood that they had just done something they themselves had not dared to believe before. They had beaten back the strongest army in the world.
After the first assault was beaten back, the battlefield on Breed's Hill sank into a tense silence. Gunpowder smoke still lingered, clinging to the burnt grass and the strained faces of the militia soldiers. They knew the battle was not over. They knew the British would return, but no one expected they would return so quickly. At the foot of the hill, General Howe was regrouping his formation, signaling his officers to tighten the ranks. Hundreds of bodies and wounded men lay scattered across the hillside, like undeniable evidence of the terrifying resistance of the colonial forces. For the British, it was not only a military defeat, but also an insult. They were forced to advance once more to prove that the empire could not be challenged by farmers with guns. The sound of the command trumpet rang out again. The red-coated line slowly stepped forward, this time slower, more cautiously. Sunlight glinted off the bayonets, making the entire hillside shimmer with the metallic glow of death. The militiamen behind the fortifications silently observed. They had fought once and won, but they also knew one thing very clearly. Their ammunition was running low. Some had only a few bullets left. The pressure weighed on them like a giant stone, and below, the footsteps of the strongest army in the world were drawing closer and closer. This second assault was not recklessness, it was revenge. The British tightened their formation, raised their bayonets, and advanced in a chilling silence. No more shouting, no more arrogant confidence like the first time. Only the cold, solemn determination of men who knew they were fighting for the honor of an entire empire. When the British reached the middle of the slope, a strong wind swept through, carrying dust and ashes. The American fortifications still stood, firm as ever, though the men behind them were exhausted, tense, and drained. They held their breath, waiting for the single moment that could decide the fate of the entire battle. Then, just as the British entered the proper firing range, the guns on the fortifications suddenly erupted once more. The roar echoed like thunder in a clear sky. Once again, rows of British soldiers fell. Many officers were hit immediately, throwing the formation behind them into confusion. The survivors tried to climb over the bodies of their comrades to advance, but the militia's second volley swept through them like a storm of steel. The British were pushed back again, this time even more chaotically than the first. One British officer later described, "We were not fighting rebels, we were fighting men who had decided they would die on the spot if necessary." In that moment, on the top of Breed's Hill, the spirit of the American people burned brighter than any flame. They did not win because of superior weapons. They won because they refused to step back. They won because they knew that behind them was not just a fortification, but the future of an entire nation. When the sun hung over the Boston sky and the gunpowder smoke from the first two assaults still had not faded, the British prepared for a third charge. The air on the hill was thick, as if the entire battlefield were holding its breath. The groans of the wounded, the cannon fire from British warships rumbling in the harbor, and the footsteps reorganizing formation made the atmosphere even heavier.
Inside the crude fortifications, the American militia soldiers seemed to feel clearly what was about to happen. They understood the British would not stop. They also understood they did not have much time left, and almost no ammunition. Many opened their cartridge pouches and saw nothing but the empty bottom. Some tried to scrape up the scattered pieces of lead on the ground. Others removed small metal scraps from buckets, pans, from the wooden nail joints of the fortifications to shove into their gun barrels as a form of makeshift ammunition. Many soldiers held only a rifle with nothing to fire. They knew it was hopeless, but they still held their guns as if holding on to a final belief. The stronger men picked up stones, bits of brick, preparing to use their own hands, their own rifle stocks as weapons in the moment of life and death. On the other side, the British began advancing up the hill for the third time. But this time there was no confidence left. They had lost too many comrades. General Howe adjusted his tactics, ordering the army to advance on the left flank, the weakest point of the American defenses. The redcoats moved like a massive wave of fire, step by step, pressing against the fortifications that were running out of strength to resist. When the distance was only a few dozen meters, many Americans pulled the trigger for the last time. The gun spat out a weak crack. A few British soldiers fell, but most continued forward. The militia understood that the moment of holding the line with gunfire was over. Now they had to fight with whatever remained. Shouts erupted. Hands tightened around rifle stocks. Blows landed with every ounce of strength left in their bodies. Some used homemade bayonets, rough and heavy, to face the sharp British steel bayonets. Some were wounded but still clung to the fortifications, refusing to abandon their positions. The battle turned into a brutal chaos where every inch of ground was fought for with blood and will. The American militia fell, one by one by one. They did not run. They were only forced back because they had nothing left to fight the British storming up like a steel tempest. Finally, when the fortifications were breached, Prescott and the commanders ordered a retreat. But it was not an act of cowardice. It was the withdrawal of warriors who had fought until their last breath. The hill was lost, but the spirit that defended it remained unbroken, immortal. In that moment, the British captured Bunker Hill. But what they saw before them, comrades lying everywhere, the exhausted militia still refusing to let go of their weapons, made them understand this was not a victory. It was a warning. A nation was awakening. A spirit was being forged in blood and fire. And the war for freedom had only just begun.
When the gunpowder smoke slowly faded and the last cannon blast died away in the sweltering afternoon of June 17, 1775, the battlefield on the hill near Boston appeared like a blood-soaked painting. On the ground littered with bodies, broken bayonets, abandoned muskets, redcoats and brown militia jackets lay intertwined, making it difficult for anyone to distinguish the line between victor and defeated. Because in that moment, even the British soldier who had just reclaimed the hill understood that the price of this victory was greater than any glory they had expected. The British Royal Army, the force considered the strongest in the world, had entered the battle with almost absolute confidence. But now, they had to face a brutal truth. More than 1,000 of their men lay dead on the slope. Hundreds of officers, professionally trained, the pillars of the army, had been shot down in the first two assaults. Those numbers not only shocked the generals, but stunned the entire British army. Until then, they had never suffered such heavy losses in a battle they should have won easily. Meanwhile, only about 450 American militia were killed or wounded. For a thin force lacking ammunition, lacking training, and made up mostly of farmers and artisans, that number forced the British leadership to ask what made the colonists fight so fiercely. General Thomas Gage, the commander, uttered a famous line, almost a bitter confession. "A few more victories like this, and England will lose the whole colony."
That statement was not an exaggeration. It was the raw truth of war. A victory is not measured only by the land taken, but by the price paid to keep it. And at Bunker Hill, the British paid far too much. Every step up the hill was a step on the bodies of comrades. Every meter of ground taken was soaked in the blood of the finest soldiers the Empire had ever possessed. They won, but no one on that battlefield that day felt like a victor. And what about the Americans? They retreated from the hill, but they did not retreat in despair. They lost the battle, but they did not fall. They lost, but they made the strongest empire of the time tremble. Their courage, resilience, and determination became an inspiration that spread throughout the colonies. News of the battle quickly traveled, and everywhere it reached, the flame of freedom burned even brighter. The price of victory at Bunker Hill was more than numbers. It was a shift in perception. It made the British understand that they were facing a people ready to die. And it made the Americans believe that the final victory was possible, even though they were only at the dawn of the revolution. There are failures that bring people to their knees, but there are also failures that make an entire nation rise. And Bunker Hill was such a failure. It was like a lightning bolt tearing across the dark sky of the war, illuminating the true strength that was quietly growing within the colonies. After the battle ended, all of Boston sank into a heavy silence. The British had taken the hill, but they did not celebrate. Not a single cheer of victory. Not a trace of pride appeared on the faces of the surviving soldiers. Instead, there was shock. They had defeated a militia that was smaller, weaker, and lacking in supplies. But in return, they paid with thousands of lives and the collapse of their absolute confidence in imperial power. A British officer wrote in his diary, "We won, but the feeling is hollow. The men we faced were not disorganized farmers. They fought like lions cornered with no way out." As for the Americans, news of the defeat spread quickly throughout the colonies. But what happened next exceeded all expectations. No one felt discouraged. No one felt defeated. Instead, a fierce flame of spirit ignited. People in Philadelphia, New York, and Virginia read the British casualty reports and realized a shocking truth. The strongest army in the world could be pushed back, heavily damaged, even shaken by farmers carrying crude weapons. This was the moment when Americans understood that the war for independence was not impossible. It could happen. They could win. In taverns, churches, and marketplaces, people began to speak of Bunker Hill as a symbol. No one mentioned the defeat. Everyone spoke of resilience. They told stories of soldiers standing firm until the last bullet, of hands drenched in bright red blood still gripping their rifles, of people who did not run, even though the enemy was twice their number and far better equipped. Those stories spread like a wind that fueled a great fire. That was the fire of the revolutionary spirit. The Continental Congress saw this. They understood that this was the golden moment to turn emotion into action. Official calls were sent across the colonies. People were encouraged to join the militia and stand up to defend their freedom. Bunker Hill became the first call, the drumbeat urging all Americans to prepare for a long but hopeful war. And from that moment, Americans entered the revolution not only with weapons, but with the belief that they truly had the ability to defeat the mightiest empire in the world. That belief was exactly what the defeat at Bunker Hill planted in their hearts. And that is why this failure became glory. When the last gunshot on the hill faded away, when the gunpowder smoke slowly dissolved into the Boston sea breeze, and when the heavy footsteps of both sides left that blood-soaked battlefield, Bunker Hill became more than a location. It became a symbol. And the legacy of that battle, even though the Americans lost, spread more powerfully than any victory they had achieved at that time. Many years after the war ended, people returned to the hill that had once witnessed the tragic sacrifice of the early revolutionary militiamen. They stood in a land that was now peaceful, listened to the wind, and imagined the scene of the breastworks built during the night, the red-coated lines advancing in silence, and the colonists fighting back with everything they had. Right on this spot, people decided to build a structure so that the spirit of that day would never be forgotten. The Bunker Hill Monument was created, built from granite, rising into the sky with a height of 67 meters. It has no intricate decorations, no elaborate statues, but it is this simplicity that creates its majesty, as if every block of stone were saying that true strength lies in determination and courage. When visitors stand at the base of the monument and look up, they do not only see a structure, they see a reminder. A nation was not built on easy victories. It was built on perseverance, on rising again after defeat, on ordinary people who were brave enough to face the mightiest army in the world without fear. Bunker Hill reminds each generation of Americans that freedom is not something that appears by chance. Freedom is the result of sacrifice. It is the result of people willing to fight even when they know they may fall. After the battle, many American leaders said that Bunker Hill was not just a fight, it was an awakening. It showed that the fighting spirit of the colonies was not impulsive, not emotional. It was real determination, a determination strong enough to make an empire cautious. The militiamen who fell that day made even the British government reconsider its strategy. And from that day on, Americans understood that they could not only fight, they could win. The legacy of Bunker Hill does not lie in the outcome of the battle, but in the change within the heart of an entire nation. The hastily buried graves on that hill planted within Americans a belief greater than themselves, a belief that a small nation could stand before a giant empire, a belief that today's defeat could not prevent tomorrow's victory, a belief that freedom is always worth fighting for. And it was this belief that led them to Yorktown in 1781, where the decisive victory gave birth to the United States of America. Bunker Hill, therefore, is not merely the beginning. It is the spiritual foundation of the entire revolution. The Battle of Bunker Hill, although recorded in history as a defeat, carried within it another victory that echoed louder than any gunshot. It was the victory of will, the victory of belief, the victory of a people who dared to rise at a moment when everything was against them. On that small hill near Boston, amid drifting smoke, amid the cannon fire shaking the earth, Americans affirmed that freedom is not a gift that is handed over. Freedom is something that must be taken, must be fought for, and must be protected with everything they have. When looking back, we do not only see a battle, we see a beginning. We see the image of ordinary farmers, rough blacksmiths, citizens with little training but with unbreakable spirit. It was they who made Britain cautious. It was they who inspired thousands of others to keep taking up arms. And it was they who laid the first foundation stone for the long journey toward the Declaration of Independence and the birth of a nation. Today, whenever we stand before the Bunker Hill Monument, we seem to hear a reminder that true strength does not come from weapons or numbers. Strength comes from the human heart, from the belief in what is right, from the determination to move forward even when the road ahead is full of darkness. If you feel anything from this story, leave a comment so we can continue discussing the fighting spirit that shaped the history of the United States. And don't forget to like and subscribe to the U.S. History Channel to continue accompanying us on emotional, authentic, and powerful journeys through history.